Do you ever wonder why, despite your prayers and your desire to hear from God, His voice seems so distant? You seek, you long, but the answer remains elusive. Have you ever asked yourself, what is it that I'm missing? What if the answer lies not in something you're doing, but in something you haven't yet understood? Something so simple yet profound, hidden in plain sight, just waiting for you to discover it. Watchman Nee, a spiritual giant whose teachings have shaped countless lives, once spoke of a key that unlocks the door to a deeper connection with God. But it's not a key you can find in a bookstore. It's not a key that comes with a fancy title or even a grand theological degree. It's a hidden key, a secret that many miss because it isn't wrapped in the flashy promises of quick fixes or instant answers. It's a key that requires the heart to be open and the spirit to be still. What if this key were not a technique or a method at all, but rather a state of being, an internal posture of the soul that allows you to hear God's voice with crystal clarity? What if the very thing you've been searching for was right there within you, ready to be unlocked? Watchman Nee's insights into this profound mystery have the power to transform how you relate to God's voice. They invite you into a deeper, more intimate relationship with the Creator of the universe. Imagine being able to hear God's whispers not just in times of crisis or desperation, but in the quiet moments of everyday life. What would your life look like if you could hear Him clearly, as though He were speaking directly to you? Would you be more confident, more aligned with your purpose, more at peace in the midst of turmoil? This isn't a pipe dream, this is the reality Watchman Nee points to. The hidden key is real, and it's waiting for you. Now the question remains, are you ready to discover this hidden key? Are you willing to quiet your heart, to listen, and to embrace the radical simplicity of what it means to hear God's voice clearly? If so, join us on this journey as we explore the profound teachings of Watchman Nee, because the key to hearing God's voice is not as complicated as you think. It's simply a matter of unlocking what's already inside you. There is a deep, almost inexplicable silence that fills the space between us and the voice of God. It's the silence we often mistake for emptiness, when in fact it is brimming with His presence. Have you ever felt that in the quiet, in the moments when the world fades away, God is closer than you realize? Watchman Nee describes this silence as the moment we stop striving and surrender. It's when we cease the constant noise within and around us that we can truly hear. But why is it so hard to hear Him? Why does it seem that God's voice is so distant? Could it be that we've been looking for Him in all the wrong places, expecting a booming voice from heaven, when He's been quietly waiting for us to listen? It is in these silent moments, Nee suggests, that the secret to hearing God's voice clearly lies. The key, he says, is not in a grand gesture or a profound experience, but in the stillness of the heart. We must quiet ourselves, surrendering our will, and allowing His presence to fill the space within us. It is through surrender that we begin to recognize His voice, soft yet unmistakable, guiding us with gentle whispers. This concept, so simple yet revolutionary, speaks to the deepest desires of the human heart, to hear the Creator, to be led by His wisdom, and to find peace in the midst of life's turmoil. But even as we seek His voice, we often encounter distractions, our own desires, our fears, the noise of the world. Watchman Nee emphasizes the importance of focusing not on the noise, but on the silence, for it is there that God speaks most clearly. When we let go of our anxieties and preconceptions, when we stop trying to force answers or solutions, we begin to hear the faint but unmistakable sound of His voice. And as we listen, we discover that God has been speaking all along, in the quietness of our hearts and the stillness of our souls. There's a paradox here. The more we try to control our lives, the less we hear from God. The more we allow ourselves to surrender and trust in His presence, the more clearly we hear His voice. It's a delicate balance between letting go and listening, an art of surrendering our control while remaining alert to His guidance. Watchman Nee's teachings remind us that the path to hearing God's voice clearly is paved with humility, trust, and a willingness to quiet ourselves before Him. As you reflect on this truth, ask yourself, how often do you create space for silence? Are you so caught up in the noise of your life that you've missed the opportunity to hear the voice of the one who created you? The hidden key lies not in doing more, but in being still and allowing the voice of God to fill the silence. Imagine being in the presence of someone you deeply respect. How do you respond? Do you listen intently, waiting for every word to come from their lips? This is the kind of posture that Watchman Nee encourages us to take toward God. It's not enough to simply ask God for guidance. We must align our hearts with His will, allowing His voice to shape our thoughts, desires, and actions. The inner posture of the heart is everything. If our hearts are closed or distracted, we cannot hear God's voice, no matter how much we desire it. Nee teaches us that hearing God is not just about an external process of asking and waiting for answers. It's about an internal transformation, one where we align our very being with His will. This alignment is not a passive act, but a deliberate choice to allow God's presence to dwell within us, guiding our every step. It's a surrendering of our own desires and plans, replacing them with His perfect will. As we make this inner adjustment, we begin to hear Him more clearly. What does this posture look like in practice? It is a heart that is soft and responsive, like clay in the hands of the potter. It is a soul that is willing to bend and yield, even when it goes against our natural inclinations. Nee's teachings challenge us to examine our hearts. Are we truly open to hearing God, or are we more concerned with our own agenda? The process of aligning our hearts with God's will is not always easy. It requires sacrifice, humility, and a willingness to let go of control. But as we yield, we find that His voice becomes more distinct, more powerful, and more life-changing. In the moments of deepest uncertainty, when our minds are clouded with doubt and fear, it is this inner posture that helps us hear God's voice. It is a heart that is open and receptive, not rigid and resistant. Watchman Nee speaks of a surrendered heart as the fertile ground where God's voice can take root. Without this posture, we are like a seed that falls on rocky soil. We may hear God, but His words will not bear fruit in our lives. As you reflect on this, consider what is the posture of your heart. Are you willing to surrender your will and listen with a heart of humility? The key to hearing God's voice more clearly is not in doing, but in being present, being open, and being willing to allow His voice to guide you. We live in a world that demands our attention, pulling us in 1,000 different directions, and yet it is often in the stillness that we find the most profound connection with God. Watchman Nee understood the power of the still, small voice, a voice that doesn't shout but gently calls, inviting us into deeper intimacy. The Bible speaks of this voice in 1 Kings, where the prophet Elijah hears God not in the wind, earthquake, or fire, but in the quiet whisper. This quiet voice is not a weakness, it is an invitation to draw closer to the heart of God. God's voice, Nee reminds us, is not bound by the noise of the world. In fact, it is often most clearly heard when we intentionally seek the quiet spaces. The still small voice may not be loud, but it is filled with power. It carries the weight of God's truth, the depth of His love, and the clarity of His direction. The problem isn't that God's voice isn't speaking, It's that we are too distracted to listen. We are too caught up in the hustle of life, too consumed with our own agendas to recognize the whisper of the divine. The power of this voice lies in its ability to cut through the chaos. When we hear God's voice in the stillness, we experience a peace that transcends understanding. It is not a fleeting emotion or a momentary comfort. It is the deep, abiding peace of knowing we are in the presence of our Creator. Watchman Nee teaches us that the still small voice is not just a method of communication, it is the very essence of God's presence with us. It is a reminder that He is near, even when the world feels far away. What would happen if we stopped searching for God in the loud, dramatic moments and began to listen in the quiet places? What if we chose to seek His voice in the stillness of the morning or in the silence of the evening? What if we slowed down long enough to hear His whisper? Nee's teachings beckon us to tune our hearts to the frequency of God's still small voice, for it is here that we find the clarity and guidance we so desperately seek. As you ponder this truth, ask yourself, when was the last time you truly listened for God's voice in the quiet? Are you willing to quiet your heart long enough to hear His whisper? The power of the still small voice awaits you, but only if you are willing to listen. Obedience. It is a word that often feels heavy, laden with expectation and sacrifice. Yet, in the teachings of Watchman Nee, obedience is not a burden, it is the path to freedom. The act of listening to God's voice and responding in obedience is a divine cycle that strengthens our relationship with Him. When we obey, we hear more clearly. When we hear more clearly, we obey more fully. It's a dance, a rhythm of surrender and trust. Nee emphasizes that the voice of God is often linked to a call to action, a prompting to take a step in faith. It's not enough to hear God's voice if we are not willing to act on what we've heard. Obedience is the response to the voice of God, and without it, the clarity we seek will remain just beyond our reach. This is why so many of us feel frustrated in our spiritual lives. We hear God's voice, but we hesitate to respond, paralyzed by fear, doubt, or our own desires. The key to hearing God's voice more clearly, according to Watchman Nee, lies in our willingness to obey. When we respond in obedience, we create an open channel for God to speak more profoundly into our lives. Obedience is not about following rules or adhering to religious duties. It is about listening to God's voice and trusting Him enough to take action. It is in the small acts of obedience that we learn to recognize God's voice more clearly and understand His will for our lives. But what happens when we disobey? Watchman Nee warns that disobedience can cloud our ability to hear God's voice. When we choose our own path, we build walls that separate us from His presence. These walls may not be obvious at first, but over time, they make it harder to hear His voice, to recognize His presence. The act of obedience, then, is not just about doing what is right. It is about remaining in a position where we can continue to hear and respond to God's leading. So ask yourself, are you hearing God's voice, but hesitating to obey? What steps of faith is He calling you to take today? Obedience is the key to unlocking a deeper, clearer relationship with God. Only through obedience can we truly hear His voice and experience His guidance in our lives. The process of learning to hear God's voice clearly is not a one-time event. It is a journey of spiritual growth, of maturation in the faith. Just as a child learns to recognize the voice of their parent over time, so too do we learn to discern the voice of God as we grow in our relationship with Him. This growth is gradual, requiring patience, perseverance, and a willingness to learn. Watchman Nee teaches us that spiritual growth is a process of being shaped and molded by God, and it takes time. As you embark on this journey, it's essential to trust the process. There will be moments of doubt, times when you wonder if you are hearing God correctly or if you are on the right path. But Nee reminds us that spiritual growth is not linear. There are peaks and valleys, moments of clarity and confusion. What matters is that we continue to press forward, trusting that God is leading us, even when we cannot see the way ahead. Growth requires us to surrender our expectations and allow God to shape us in His timing. We must trust that His voice will become clearer as we grow deeper in relationship with Him. As we continue to walk in obedience and cultivate the posture of listening, we will find that His voice becomes more distinct, more powerful, and more life-changing. If you are struggling to hear God's voice, remember this growth takes time. Trust the process. Trust that God is speaking to you in ways you may not yet fully understand. And as you continue to seek His voice with an open heart, you will begin to hear Him more clearly than ever before. In the end, the journey of hearing God's voice clearly is one of transformation, a transformation that takes place in the depths of our hearts as we grow closer to Him. Are you ready to trust the process? Are you willing to surrender and grow in your ability to hear His voice? The journey begins now. Throughout this journey, you've been challenged to view silence not as emptiness, but as a sacred space where God waits to be heard. The key to hearing His voice with clarity is not found in loud declarations or outward manifestations, but in the stillness of the heart and the surrender of our will. What Watchman Nee has taught us is that God does not speak to the noisy, but to those who in silence give themselves fully to Him. When you learn to silence the voices of the world and focus on His divine whisper, clarity will come. And like a river, it will flow into your life, bringing peace, direction, and purpose. Perhaps until now, the idea of hearing God's voice seemed distant or even impossible. But what Nee teaches us is that within each of us, there's a deep and natural listening, a tuning that just needs to be adjusted. He is not a distant God, but a close God who longs to communicate intimately with His children. The question is not whether God is speaking, but whether we are willing to stop, listen, and obey. The hidden key lies in our ability to surrender, to stop seeking answers in the noise of life, and to focus on the soft yet firm guidance He offers. The moment you choose not just to hear but to obey, the cycle of your relationship with God intensifies. You begin to realize that true freedom comes from obedience. By hearing His voice and responding, you become more aligned with His purpose, more sensitive to His presence, more confident in His directions. This is the path Watchman Nee proposes, not one of searching for complex methods or magic formulas, but of living in tune with God's will, day by day, step by step. But there's one undeniable truth that remains etched in the heart until you surrender, until you quiet your soul and open your heart. God's voice will remain distant. He does not force His way in, He waits to be invited. The invitation is simple, that you choose stillness, obedience, and an open heart. That you recognize that at the most unexpected moment, when the noise fades, God is waiting to speak with you in a way that will transform your life forever. Now, as you reflect on all that has been shared, I ask you, what will you do with this key? Will you continue to search for answers in the rush of the world, or will you commit to opening your heart to hear God's voice clearly? If this message touched you deeply, leave your mark here. Like, share, and comment below. I hear the wisdom of God. And of course, subscribe to the channel so we can continue this journey of learning and growth together. Because when you start hearing God's voice clearly, your life will never be the same.